Hello, my friends. Mary Rose here, and it is Wednesday, June 1st at 1 p.m. Pacific time. I welcome all of you to this live stream, our weekly little date where we talk about writing craft, story structure, and the mindset of the working, thriving writer, which is what I hope you are feeling like today. I'm grateful to see some of you already here and saying hi. If you're here, please say hello in the comments and let me know you are. And if you are watching on Facebook, you can also let me know you're here by going to streamyard.com/Facebook. Give permission to show your name. If you've done it already, you probably don't have to do it again, but I'll keep an eye in the comments. If you don't do that, you can still leave a comment. It just doesn't tell me what your name is. And so I have to talk to you as if we don't already know each other, which, in many cases, we do already know each other because many of you come week after week, and I appreciate it so much. Waving hello to Hillary. Lovely to see you here, Hillary. And waving hello to Anne. Thanks for leaving a comment, letting me know you're here. All right, what's today's topic? It's metaphysical, it's practical. It has to do with our writing, and it has to do with us. It's one of those multi-layered, ice cream sundae type questions. It's got a little bit of everything in it that I really love these types of questions. So I want to say a special thank you to Anne for starting this conversation with me by asking a very provocative question that's got me thinking. Those are the best kinds of questions, not the ones that we can just rattle off an answer to, but the ones that we go, wait a minute. Interesting. Let's pursue it. Maybe we can learn something together. So the question today is this: are we the narrators of our books? Are we personally? Am I Mary Rose? Are you Anne? Are you Hillary? Are you whoever's watching this now live or on a replay? Are you personally the narrator of your book? Are you kind of the puppet master there? But if we turn, the curtain away, if we pull the curtain away, it would be you in the fullness of your real identity. Interesting. Are we the narrators of our books? It's a complicated question. And if the answer is no, which, I'm not going to tip off my ultimate position here, but I think the answer might end up being, not so quick to say yes. If the answer is no, and we're not the narrators of our books, who is? It's a very interesting thing to discuss. Where does the writer's identity go when we write? Really looking forward to discussing this with you. And anybody who's ever struggled with questions of finding, let's say, the voice or choosing the right point of view for a book, this discussion is going to nibble away at the edges of those types of questions. So stay tuned and be ready to pop your questions in the comment box so we can weave them into the discussion. I always love to do that. So before we begin this discussion of identity, allow me to introduce myself. Nice segue there, right? I'm Mary Rose Wood. I myself am an author. I am best known for writing middle grade fiction. My most recent book is called Alice's Farmer Rabbit's Tale. And I'm also the author of a 6-book series called The Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place. And I'm going to probably mention my own books as part of this discussion, not because there are other books are not worth talking about. Well, I'm going to mention a lot of books, as I always do in these discussions, but because I'm talking about the personal relationship between who we are and the narrator of our books, I'm going to use some personal examples as well. It seems necessary and fruitful to do that. Perhaps some of you will put personal examples in the comments too. That might be a benefit to everyone. I'm also, by the way, in addition to all of that, let me not forget to say, I'm also the founder of Path of the Storyteller, which is it's my own platform for training and mentoring writers. I have a wonderful community of folks who've gone through the Path of the Storyteller program, folks who are planning to go through it this fall, which is the next time it's going to be offered. And so if you want to learn more about that, just make sure you're on the mailing list. It's easy enough to find at www.pathofthestoryteller.com. Very good. I look forward to all of you joining the mailing list and starting a dialogue with me so we can get to know each other. All right. Here's the question. Who's writing our books? Who's writing them? Are we writing them? Wouldn't it be great? There's that old fairy tale about the elves that come into the shoemaker's shop and make all the shoes while they're sleeping. Wouldn't it be wonderful? Has anyone ever had this fantasy that the novel writing elves could just sneak into our offices and open up our laptops and write our novels while we're sleeping, or, doing something that doesn't involve sitting here with furrowed brow for hours on end? Alas, I'm here to tell you, I've been a novelist for a long time, many, many years. I think I have 14 published novels now, and I have yet to have the experience of the novel writing elves coming in during the night and doing the work for me. Maybe I just haven't been lucky. Maybe they haven't gotten around to me yet, but my feeling is that they don't exist, that actually some version of us is the one writing our books. But is it us? Is it us? I'm going to start with some basic differentials here, but then we're going to dig into the more complicated metaphysics of this question. So here's some of the basic things that I know you're already saying to yourself. Like, what if I'm writing in the first person? All right. So let's talk about point of view just for a minute to sort out how this question is connected to point of view. As I'm sure you all know, when we choose to write a book in the first person point of view, we have chosen to let a fictional character, who is almost certainly the main character of the book, the hero of the tale, if you will, be the narrator. We've put that character in charge of the microphone. They've got the storyteller's job. And so when we read a book written in the first person, you will see that the character is speaking in the first person. They will say things like, "Reader, I married him," or "I was born in a trunk in the Princess Theater," which isn't from a novel, but you see my point. They're telling a story as themselves to the reader. So that's what it means to write in the first person. So when we write in the first person, the question of, are we the narrators of our books, has a simple answer, which is no. Jane Eyre is the narrator of Jane Eyre. Katniss Everdeen is the narrator of The Hunger Games. But Jane Eyre is fictional and Katniss Everdeen is fictional, right? So they can't actually be telling their own story, can they? No. You know this. There's a difference between reality and fiction, kind of. See, this is where the metaphysics come in. And so even as I'm saying, well, the simple answer is, well, if in first person, the narrator is a fictional character, you have written that fictional character. You've created them. You are the one putting the words in their fictional mouth. So it's not such a simple answer. But the mask of a fictional character is the one narrating the book. Like you've got a mask on in some way. You've created something that is the fictional narrator of the fictional book that you're writing. If we're writing in the third person, this is where this question of, are we the narrators of our books, actually gets asked surprisingly often. I mean, I've had it posed to me, because a third person narration is just like, it's a conceit of storytelling. It's something we've all agreed on, that we can open up a book written in the third person and it can start and say, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," and just go on to tell the tale. And we don't necessarily say, "Wait a minute, who's talking to me? Like, who's talking to me? Who said that?" We are fluent as readers. We understand how fiction works. And so when the story begins, even though there's this kind of unnamed narrating voice on the page that launches into a story, we go along for the ride. So that's a third person narrator. Now, writing in the third person and writing in the first person are two different narrative strategies. And I've done other live streams on this channel about how you might choose which one is the right one for this particular book. There's a lot of things you need to think about the scope of the storytelling, what experience you want to have for the reader, and all this other stuff. So we're not going to talk about that today. We're not going to talk about how to choose between first person and third person. Instead, I want to focus on this truth that they have in common, which is whether you've put a mask of a character over the narrative voice that's telling the story, or whether you've chosen not to put such an obvious mask, but this kind of subtle, like, just little fog of, I'm not going to tell you who's telling the story exactly, but I trust that you as a fluent reader are just going to go along for this ride because you know how third person works. It's still something that you've invented, right? And so there are layers of personality at play. There might be a fictional character as the mask, or there might just be this narrative voice that doesn't have a name as the mask. And there are other options as well, which we're definitely going to talk about. But um, I want to just leave that little example there of the sort of complexity of who's telling the story. Put that to the side because that's the tough question, right? That's what we kind of have come here together to examine. Let's look at what it's not. I find that that's sometimes a useful thought exercise when you're trying to figure out what something is, to look at what it's not. There are many types of writing that we, in our own real life identities, are the narrator of. Now, I'm sure that you can think of some. I will name some that came to mind when I was preparing my notes for today's talk. If I write you a letter, a personal note, I, Mary Rose, am writing to you. I'll use this opportunity to say hi to Nancy, who's here, and who notes, by the way, that there's not much of a difference between real life and fiction. How true that is, Nancy. I can't argue with that at all. The metaverse just keeps growing and turning in on itself, doesn't it? So if I decide to write a personal letter to Nancy, I'm going to say, hi, Nancy, it's me, Mary Rose, and this is what my day was like, and how are you? And I'll just write a nice little note, and I'll send it to her. That's me talking as me. It's this person, right? And if I start including anecdotes, Nancy, you'll never guess what I did today. I fell down a rabbit hole and I ended up meeting a Cheshire cat whose smile disappeared. And all of a sudden, I'm in the world of fiction. If I start saying things that are patently untrue, I'm not, Nancy might be amused by it because she knows me, but I'm no longer really writing as myself. I've created a fiction in which there's now a fictional Mary Rose narrating. So it's a slippery slope, my friends. So let's just talk about the personal letter in which we are truly ourselves. That's an example of when we are the narrator. We are the narrator. If I write a blog post, as I do once a week, typically, as I prepare my topic for the live stream, I create a little blog post on the Path of the Storyteller website. I copy it. Sometimes I cut it down. I email it to everyone on my mailing list, like you all ought to be, so that they know what we're going to be talking about today, can come prepared with their thoughts and questions. That blog post is me talking. It's me, Mary Rose, telling you what I'm going to talk about on the live stream this week, sharing what I've been thinking about, letting you know that Anne asked me a great question and it's really got my wheels turning. It's real. It's me. I sign my name at the bottom. That's me talking. Or narrating, let's say. All right. This is me talking. But when we start to write it down, we elevate it to narrating. I am the narrator of my blog post. I am the narrator of my personal correspondence. This is super clear so far, I hope. That's when I am truly the narrator. Here are other more literary examples of when the writer is actually the narrator. Memoir. If we decide to write a memoir, which so many of us do, I've never decided to write one, but I come across writers all the time who are working on memoir, and I think that's fantastic. A memoir, by definition, is an individual telling a story in written form to the reader. And by calling it a memoir, they are asserting to the reader that this is true stuff. It's like autobiography, the difference between memoir and autobiography, I'm not even going to try to tease apart what difference there may be. To me, one of them is a little bit more of a fact-based narrative of this is the life that I've had. It's almost like a historical exploration of somebody's life versus a memoir, which is a truthful but perhaps more curated um, uh, version with some literary ambition of true things, true elements of someone's life that they're going to present for a particular effect, not in a comprehensive, like Dickensian, I was born on this day, this is the entire story of my life and everything that happened, right? So I think that's a kind of a fuzzy distinction and maybe not a very good one. But we all know what I mean when I say memoir. If someone is writing a memoir, they are asserting that they themselves are telling you the story of stuff that they experienced, and therefore they know it's true. That's what a memoir is. So in those examples, the writer is telling the story and in fact is sort of present in the text, right? I'm telling in my blog post what I'm thinking about. I'm telling in my personal letter to a friend what's going on with me. And I'm telling the reader of my memoir these big events of my life and thematically what they meant and how I changed and grew as a result. But it's all about me, 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 me. These are not the only forms of writing that let the writer kind of stand in front of the book in a sense. There's a really interesting body of work that is very compelling and very enduringly popular of a kind of a journalistic nonfiction. There's a lot of terms that I've heard applied to this kind of writing. Narrative journalism. At one point, it was called the new journalism, but I think that was a long time ago. So it's probably not the new journalism anymore. It's narrative journalism or creative nonfiction. You've heard these terms. What do they all mean? It doesn't matter. What I'm talking about is the kind of journalistic examination of the world of real people or real events in which the journalist, the writer, the person who's going to take us on this exploration is present in the work. So it's not a history textbook. That's the difference, right? When you read a history textbook, the impression that you are intended to get, true or not, is that this is an impersonal body of research has been done, and by this impersonal body of experts who are striving to just depict the truth. They're giving you the facts. They're telling a story, right? And it's a true thing that happened, but they themselves are not asserting that they were there or that they were affected by the events or that they even played a role in shaping the events. This is a different and more modern style of journalistic reporting where the journalist kind of gets in the mix. If you are a fan of this kind of writing, you probably know some of the really influential writers who've written this way. Truman Capote is one of the ones who is often given credit for diving into true stories, reporting on murders or whatever, but kind of keeping himself as part of the storytelling. Hemingway wrote pieces like this. Jack London wrote pieces like this. So this was a kind of a thing where the writer, and I forgive me for using three kind of, examples of big male personalities, but I do think that there might be something to that connection, because this is an example of there's a story to be told, and the writer who has the ambition to tell the story wants to be part of the story at the same time they're telling it. So they're kind of inserting themselves into the narrative. It's has a little bit of an ego about it, I think. It doesn't necessarily make it bad, but it certainly makes it more personal and immediate, okay? An example that I know and like, and that is more recent and has a kind of a different vibe about it, was the basis of a film called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, which is a really good film about this example centering around Fred Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers. That film was based on an article that was published in the magazine Esquire by a journalist named Tom Junot. And so this is what happened. It was a 1998 article, and Tom Junot was given the assignment to go write a profile of Mr. Rogers. And he didn't particularly have a history or an attachment to Mr. Rogers. And so he went to go write the article, and he came into the presence of Fred Rogers. And what happened? His life was changed, as anybody's would be, by becoming a close friend of Fred Rogers. He had a transformational experience. And instead of writing a profile of Mr. Rogers, he ended up including the impact on his own hardened, cynical heart, right? The impact on his own feelings about himself and about life and what it meant to be vulnerable and how we might be kind to each other. Like, this meeting shook him up. It shook him to his core. It was a transformational encounter. Well, doesn't that sound like a story? Now, you all know that story is about transformation of consciousness. This is a true real life event of a journalist who was sent to do a job, to write an article about somebody else who ended up being the main character of a story of transformation of consciousness, a spiritual journey that's really happened to him as a consequence of being given this assignment. So the article in Esquire turned into this piece of creative nonfiction. Yes, we get a profile of Mr. Rogers, but we also get the experience of the journalist, the transformation of the journalist. Sounds like a really fun story, right? Well, if you think so, you're not alone. It was a very well regarded piece in Esquire. And then about 10 years later, it was made into a movie starring Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers, and was also, very much enjoyed by people. So I'm still teasing apart all of these ways that the writer actually is the narrator of the story, that the writer is in the story. But these are very specific examples, right? We're talking about memoir, we're talking about personal writing, correspondence, blogging, writing op-ed pieces, writing in this kind of creative nonfiction style. This is, none of this is novels, right? These are not novels that I'm talking about. This is a different landscape of writing, all of which are well worth exploring. So that's what we're setting apart, like, as when the writer is in the story. The minute we're writing fiction, and this original question from Anne actually came in the context of fiction writing. The minute we're writing fiction, we're not the narrator. We're not, because we are in service to a made-up story in a made-up world populated with fictional characters. And if I tried to insert myself as Mary Rose into a fictional narrative, into a fictional world, if I wrote a version of Jane Eyre in which I just magically showed up and Jane and I went out to lunch and, I advised her on her relationship problems with Mr. Rochester. And if I wrote that, it would be super fun. But that's not me. That's a fictional character. Because guess what? That's not going to happen. Alas, that's never going to happen in this lifetime, because that's made up. It's fictional. Even if I create a character with my name who looks like me and talks like me, it's not me. It's a fictional character. Now, this is where this gets super fun in that, like, metaphysical way. We start thinking of movies like Being John Malkovich, where there's a character who's based on a person, but we know that it's not the person because it's not a documentary film. It's a work of fiction. So the minute we're in fiction, there's really no possibility that we are the narrator of the piece. If we pretend to, then we've made ourselves fictional, which, that some of us might like to do, but, I don't know how you get back from that particular metaverse. So what do we do instead? If it's not us, if we truly are not the narrator, what's going on the page when we write fiction? So now let's get down to brass tacks. And I just want to say this is an extremely practical question. As fun as it is to talk about these different forms and the metaphysics of it all, it's a very practical question. Why? Because we cannot write a single sentence of fiction without grappling with this question of who's telling this and to whom. Like, what is it that is on the page? Who's doing this talking? The minute we put words down on the page, they have some kind of source. We've already established that the source cannot be us. So who is it? So it's very practical, and we find ourselves grappling with this. Now, I already talked about the example of the first person. So you draw your main character, and it's almost always your main character, as a narrator, and you put them in charge of telling the story to the reader. And where are you in this? You are in off stage, in the wings, as we say in theater. You are not there in the book. You are off stage, putting words in the mouth of this character. It's like a performance. Anything that you need to happen in your book, you have to channel through the performance of this fictional character. Now, anybody that's ever written a complicated book in the first person knows that this is not easy to do. It's very much like that sort of fantastic witticism by Ginger Rogers when people would praise Fred Astaire's dancing, and she would say, yeah, well, I do everything he does, but backwards and in high heels. I'm sure you've all heard that. Go, Ginger. When we are writing a novel in the first person, which so many writers delude themselves into thinking is a kind of an easy choice, we have to do everything any novelist has to do, but backwards in high heels, because we have to do it in the plausible voice of a fictional character. We've got to keep the performance going, line after line after line. And we have to stay within the constraints of that fictional character. If that fictional character is a kid who knows certain things and doesn't know certain things, we've got to be true to that. If that fictional character is living in a world where transportation is slow, right? That we can't just jump around location by quick cutting from scene to scene without abandoning the conceit of first person, because we've got to get our narrator where the action is. And what if that's going to take her 12 months by steamship and, pony rides and hot air balloons? Like, we really have to think about these things when we write in the first person. So there's a fictional character, and we are channeling our storytelling through this fictional character. Third person is where this question really becomes confusing and tempting in a way, because in the third person narrative, who's saying this in a hole in the ground? There lived a hobbit. Is that Tolkien talking? Is it? I'm going to argue that even in the third person, we trust the reader's fluency with the conceits of this, but it's still not us. It's still not us. Because we're not in the story. We can't be in this world of the story. It's a flight of the imagination. And the narrator, the third person narrator of an invented world, by definition has to be an invention. There's really no other way to think about it. Now, is this a bad thing or a good thing? It's a great thing, in my opinion, because what we're trying to create with our third person narrator is the perfect storytelling consciousness to give the reader of this particular book the best experience. And we have a lot of choices. Third person is like, there's an image I use in the Path of the Storyteller program. It's like one of these vast California superhighways. It's got like a dozen lanes on each side. It gives us a lot of choices. So we always have to choose what lane we're driving in, but we might change lanes. We might change lanes over a few different options over the course of a narrative. And in fact, we almost certainly will change lanes. So let me talk about some of the lanes that we can choose and how they each ask us to do a different type of invention, not us, but some kind of invented consciousness to do the job of telling the story to the reader. First, the real show-offy types of third person, of which I'm a fan. I have to say, I am kind of a fan. And this is where I'm going to call myself out by talking about some of my own books. There are show-offy types of third person that actually do try to draw attention to themselves a little bit. One of them is kind of the invented narrator or the framing device. So it's basically a third person narration, but within the third person narration, We're about to get super layered now. Within the third person narration, we have invented a fictional narrator who's going to tell the story to the reader. One of the things that came to mind for me is, believe it or not, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a poem, a long poem by Samuel Coleridge, but it's a story, a gripping one, I might add, about a shipwreck. And within the poem, there's a character. There's this old wedding guest who tells this story of the shipwreck and the albatross and the icebergs and all this like cool stuff that happens in the poem. It's all very mysterious and magical, but it's a story that's told to the listener. So the narrator, the writer, has invented a narrator embedded in the fictional world. You can see that there are books out there that use framing devices like this, where there's somebody within the narrative who's telling a story to somebody else. Perhaps I'm not going to belabor a lot of examples, but if anyone can think of a book like that that you want to call out as an example, leave it in the comments. I'm sure that those of you who have kids are familiar with the Lemony Snicket books. This is the series of unfortunate events. It's a long and popular series for the middle grade reader. And in this particular instance, the real author, his name is Daniel Handler, invented a fictional author named Lemony Snicket, who is the writer of those books, allegedly, and who also ends up having some kind of role in the plot. So I'm talking about the show-offy examples where people just can't leave third person alone. They've got to add this, the bells and whistles of tying a bow on it. So not only we have a fictional consciousness, but the fictional consciousness is fancy and layered. Now, I am going to put myself on the spot as well. Oh, great example from Nancy before I put myself on the spot. Absolutely. Scheherazade. Perfect. 1001 Nights. When you've got a story that's about someone telling a story, right? We get the double pleasure of seeing the story of the storyteller and also the story that the storyteller is telling. Right? That made sense, I'm sure. So let me put myself on the spot as well, because we're talking about show-offy third-person approaches. So in the series that I mentioned earlier, that I wrote, a middle grade series called The Incorrigible Children of Ashton Plays, I invented, after a great deal of trial and error, I might say, a narrative voice being in a third person, telling a story that is set in Victorian England, which I'm here to tell you, and some of my readers probably would have a hard time understanding this. I myself was not alive in Victorian England, so I couldn't possibly, if it were me narrating, know all the things that happen in this book. So I invented a narrator who is intimately familiar with the ways of life in Victorian England and is telling the story of this cast of characters, all of them unspooling in the mid-19th century. But the narrating consciousness, who's never given a name and who does not participate in the narrative at all, like Lemony Snicket might, this narrating consciousness actually is telling the story to kids of the present day, as I am. But I'm not in the book. This is a fictional narrating consciousness. And occasionally, or I should say, not that occasionally, pretty often, turns away from the story that's going on in the mid-19th century and speaks to the contemporary reader and explains something about what it might mean to live in this time, or goes on a little philosophical digression about an idea that's come up in the narrative, or has something clever to say about, some commentary about it. Now, this is a kind of an interruption of the plot, right? This is what we call an intrusive narrator. And so this is another kind of fancy pants, smarty pants, third person narrator, because this intrusive narrator, like Truman Capote, Ernest Hemingway, Jack London, is situating themselves as a kind of standing in front of the story. They don't want you to forget that they're there. They want to engage with you a little bit directly, right? So every now and then the story's going on, we're immersed in the events and the characters, but every now and then the narrator says, but wait a minute, hang on, we're just going to press the pause button. Let me give you a little extra. I'm going to explain a little piece. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you that. It's like watching the director's cut of a movie, right? With the narration on. There's just a little commentary woven in. Now, this is a lot of fun to do. If this is your idea of fun, it's a lot of fun to do. If it's not your idea of fun, obviously not. But here's something I want to make very clear. Just because something is fun to do doesn't mean we should do it. I think we all know that, right? Let me talk particularly about the intrusive narrator, because I wrote 6 books with an intrusive third-person narrator. And I get asked this question a lot. And it's one of the reasons I think that this notion of is the narrator us gets asked, because somebody is intruding into the fiction, right? When you use an intrusive narrator or an invented narrator like Lemony Snicket, there's this intrusion, right? It's like you're watching a play and the playwright peeks out from behind the curtain just to try to check on how everything's going. Are the people laughing, right? But in full view of the audience. The intrusive narrator is a tricky thing to pull off because it interrupts the story. That's the main issue with the intrusive narrator. Every time the playwright pokes her head out from behind the curtain and says, "How are you liking the play? Do you have any questions that I can answer? Let me tell you a little bit more about the scene you just saw," right? It's obviously an interruption. And if we were at the theater and the playwright kept doing that over and over and over again, we would get annoyed, because at a certain point, it's going to interfere with us enjoying the play. Now, so this is a risky thing to do. It's risky. And I can tell you my solution about how to figure out when this is worth doing and when it's not worth doing. And if you are doing it for a good reason, when is too much. It's worth doing if it's truly part of the conception of the book, if it truly adds something essential to the book. And so if you have, in the case of this series that I'm talking about, my calculus that I did within myself was, in order to write this the way I want to write it in this setting, I need to make the setting fun. I need to make the historical period fun. I need to make the kind of parody of a Victorian governess novel accessible to the contemporary middle grade reader. I have to let them in on the joke, in other words. It's all very amusing for me to write a Victorian governess novel because I'm still thinking about going out to lunch with Jane Eyre. That's who I am. But I can't necessarily count on the contemporary 10 or 11-year-old who's going to pick up this book to come to it with that cultural reference. I have to build a little scaffolding around it that will make it fun for them. And so, as I often say, you have to think of the reader's experience. If making a choice like an intrusive narrator or a fictionalized narrator like Lemony Snicket is going to improve the reader's experience, you might be able to convince me it's a good idea. But if you read a book that has a funny intrusive narrator, like the Incorrigible Children books or like Lemony Snicket's books, and you say, "Oh, that's so amusing, I'm going to put that in my book," but your book is some, kind of contemporary adventure that has no particular requirement for anything like this, please just ask yourself what you're doing. And I've seen it happen where somebody really loves that kind of slightly arch, like faux Jane Austen-y kind of wit, and they like it. And then they use it to tell a contemporary tale about a kid in the science fair. And I'm thinking, I'm just not sure that this voice and that story have anything to do with each other, right? So that's an example of where you just might be having fun with something you enjoyed, but it's not serving your book. So for me, creating that narrator was both a way of casting a spell of like long ago, while also bridging the gap between the events of the story and the contemporary reader, and importantly, adding a ton of comedy. Every time I interrupted the story, I had to ask myself, is the reader going to stay with me? Is by interrupting the story here, am I giving the reader something that they're going to like better than just letting them watch this scene uninterrupted? I call it the cupcake theory, right? Like you've given the reader like this beautiful cake of your storytelling, right? But every now and then, just as they're about to put this beautiful spoonful of cake in their mouths, you interrupt them and they have to wait to get back to the cake. You better sure that while you've interrupted them, you're handing them a cupcake. Like you have to give them something extra, something bonus, something that makes it better so they don't feel like you're just keeping me from my cake. Now, I hope that that makes sense to you. I see some really great questions coming up, so I'm going to get to those in a second. All right. So that's a little talk about intrusive narrator. It's not me. It's something that I've invented in order to deliver the story in a particular way. Now, actually, let's see. Let me talk about these intrusive narrator questions now, since we're on the topic. I'm going to bring up a question from Nancy. Do I create a full-blown character for an intrusive narrator, or is it just the voice? So that's a really interesting question, Nancy, because I would say that in the Lemony Snicket books, if I'm not mistaken, and someone can correct me if I am, there is a backstory for that character who's intrusive and speaks to the reader, because that particular intrusive narrator ends up being woven into the tale. In the Incorrigible Children books, the narrator that I invented was not a character who ended up being intruding into the tale. It was literally a narrating consciousness who was telling the story to the contemporary reader. Now, full-blown character, I would say no, but character, yes. So full-blown character would mean that I knew who this person was, how old they were, how they came to be telling this story, what their childhood was like, and really kind of making a narrative about them. I didn't need to do that, and I didn't want to, but I liked this character having a point of view. And when I say this character, what I really mean is this narrating consciousness that I invented. I really liked giving this narrating consciousness a point of view, because I think a consciousness has a point of view. And so this particular one, has a certain voice, a certain way of expressing, but also has an opinion about progress. This is one of the defining traits of this narration. Since this consciousness's job is, in a sense, to bridge the gap between then and now. For the reader, it has an opinion about then and now. It often thinks that things used to be better in the past. And there are many comments throughout the book about progress and about nowadays. Nowadays we do things this way. In the past, we did things a different way. And often this narrating consciousness will express a kind of a rueful, like, yes, things are not as interesting nowadays as they used to be. So what does this serve the reader? It does two things. It is a source of comedy. There's a lot of comedy drawn out of this, but it also keeps luring the reader back into the past. Like, I know this is different from the way we live now, but this was very interesting. The way people used to live was very different and very interesting. And was it better? What do you think? Let's go back and find out. So you see, it adds a sense of storytelling to it. So that is one trait that I endow that narrating consciousness with. But you see that it was for the reader, and it was very much about this particular story. I hope that's a useful answer. Now, let's see what Anne has to say. Great question, Anne. Anne asks, would you say that using intrusive narration in order to use a narrative voice that's occasionally more sophisticated than a child reader will understand without some defining of terms? Let me read that again. Using intrusive narration in order to use a narrative voice that's occasionally more sophisticated than a child reader will understand without some defining of terms. So, see, I get it, Anne. So I think there was just a couple of words missing. I had to read it twice. I think what you're asking is it enough of a reason to use an intrusive narrator to simply create a shift in tone? And what my answer is going to be, and of course, I'm not looking at a particular thing that you wrote right now. I can't actually tell you whether it's working or not, or if it's a good idea or not. Okay. But in general, the principle of your question is, how much of a reason, do you need to use an intrusive narrator? If you don't need to go full bore defining terms and stuff, knowing, as I've just said, that every time you use that intrusive narrator, you're interrupting the story. So you better have a reason, and you better have some kind of cupcake to keep your reader not only entertained, not only willing to go along with the intrusions, but eager for the next one. Because the next one comes, they're going to get another cupcake. I think that is a writer's question to decide whether you have a sufficient reason to do it. But to shift the narrative voice into something a little bit more sophisticated than the child reader would understand is not a great one, because why would you want to write a book for children that chunks of it were written in a way that the child reader couldn't understand? Like, you have to examine that motive. And maybe it's not, maybe you're asking a question that's a little bit different than what you're really trying to solve. There are different lanes in third person, and you can shift lanes within third person without being intrusive. And it does give you the opportunity to shift the voice of the narration. And I think that might be what you're looking for. So let me return to that idea of shifting lanes in third person in just a minute. I'm going to just bring in one more question about this intrusive narrator before we move away from that topic. Ellen, so glad you're here. Ellen asks, if you left the intrusive narrator aspect out of the incorrigibles, would the narrator have been solely third person omniscient? Okay. Well, you're going to help me get back into this idea of changing lanes in third person. So there is no such thing as solely third person omniscient, right? So that's this idea of changing lanes. When we write in third person, and this is the way I explain it, you might find someone else who explains it differently. Fine. I'm going to explain it this way because this is how it makes sense to me. And I love to write in third person. When you write in third person, sometimes you might be omniscient. Sometimes this narrative consciousness might know a lot of things. It might go into the heads of different characters. It might know things that nobody in the book knows. It might be offering context or historical information that is not, immediately accessible to the fictional characters you've created. That's omniscience, right? All-knowing. You can create an all-knowing, omniscient narrator. This narrator might even know what's going to happen to these characters in the future, right? So that's true omniscience, a kind of a godlike knowing. But we don't necessarily write a third-person novel in that stance all the time. We shift lanes. We do what I call change the distance. We zoom in, and we end up writing, in my opinion, most of the book in a close third person stance that is allied to the protagonist. So this turns into kind of a technical discussion, a point of view. I don't want to get too down that rabbit hole, but a close third person narration is one in which the third person narrator voluntarily takes on the rules and regulations of writing in the first person, does not switch to the first person, but writes in the third person in such a way that they are locked into one character's experience, their inner life, their train of thought, their emotional life, their physical experiences, the things that are going on in their bodies that nobody else could know, and takes on even the inflected quality of that character's way of thinking and talking, and observes and experiences the events of each scene as that character experiences them, and does not freely hop into the experiences of other characters. That is the lane of close third person. Now, are we going to drive in that lane exclusively? No, because when we're in the third person, we can keep changing lanes as the story demands. Learning how and when to change lanes is one of the things that makes writing the third person tricky at first and exhilarating once you get a hang of it, because you can do anything in third person. So that is the, in a sense, an answer for both you, Ellen, and also for Anne's earlier question, which is that when you're writing in the third person, you don't need to create a whole showboaty intrusive narrator situation just to change lanes into a more omniscient position. You can just change lanes, right? You can zoom in and write from a close third person when the storytelling demands it, which it often will, right? Because the reader is there for a vicarious experience. They want to have a character to inhabit. They want to be able to experience the book as your main character experiences it. So even in third person, we're going to spend most of our time like really, even sitting on the shoulder is not quite accurate. It's really just like becoming an avatar with the main character. So we give the reader that great fictional ride. So great questions, guys. Thank you for like drawing this discussion into such technical, useful stuff. I think it's, things that you can all think about. If you've got more questions, put them in the comments. If questions come later, come back and put them in the comments on the replay because I'll be able to answer them. So 2 more things that I want to just say as we wrap up. Since this idea that we are not the narrator, but the narration, no matter how we slice it, no matter which choice we take, is kind of an invention. It's a thing that we invent. We can then extrapolate that this narration might change and probably will change from book to book. So I don't change. I'm still me. I mean, I've gotten older and my opinions develop, and hopefully I become wiser with age. It's my goal. But I'm still me. I've been the same person my whole life, and I'm going to be the same person for the rest of my life. My identity doesn't change, but the narrating consciousness of my books is a kind of an interesting thing, right? That I build for that book. And then for another book, I build a different one because I don't need an intrusive narrator to translate Victorian England to the contemporary reader for my contemporary book about life on a farm in the Hudson Valley. I don't need that. I build a different narrating consciousness. Guess what? They're both third person, but they're very different. And so this is why we have to let go of this notion of like, oh, I'm the narrator of my books. No, you're not. You're really not. So you're going to have this book specific approach to it. And the 3 things that you're going to look at that overlap are the voice of the narration, which we haven't really talked too much about the definition of voice, but I think you can all extrapolate from this conversation what I mean by it. The narrator itself has a way of talking, a way of thinking, a personality. All of that comes into play when we talk about what's the voice. And the close third person point of view of the main character, right? Because that's going to be one of the lanes that you drive in most of the time when you're writing in the third person. So there's got to be some relationship between the overall voice of the narration and the voice, if you will, of the close third person point of view of your main character, because you're going to be switching back and forth between those 2 lanes a lot. And then the world of the book. Where is the book set? When is the book set? What's the vibe of it? You don't need a faux Jane Austen voice to tell a contemporary story set on a farm, right? So you need to think about the world of the book as well. I'm going to say those 3 things again because this is really useful. You got to think about the voice of your overall narration and the voice as it might be expressed when you're writing in a close third person point of view, and also how this suits the world of the book, how it makes the world of the book come alive for your reader. All right. Now, this is a great question from Cynthia. How do you change lanes clearly without confusing the reader? Cynthia, the same way you change lanes on the superhighway, you put on your signal and you commit, and you don't weave back and forth. You go from one to the other with a clear signal to the reader, and then you stay there for a while. This is a pretty technical question. So that's the answer that I can give without sort of going back and reviewing that whole deep dive into how third person works. But why don't we bring back this question for a future live stream? I think it would be a good one. It would be a good one to talk about. So let's talk about the concluding thoughts here. I would say that my way of thinking about this notion of where is the writer in our work, like where do we stop and where does the work begin, is this sentence, which is that the writer of fiction, I'm putting aside all those nonfiction examples that we explored earlier in this talk, But the writer of fiction is both everywhere and nowhere in the work. All of it's coming from you, right? All of it is expressing something about the way you see the world, what your authentic emotional life is like. You're not imitating other writers. We all imitate other writers when we're developing and when we learn, and we're often inspired by other writers. But fundamentally, it's going to be your heart that ends up on the page, your values, your special way of seeing the world, what you understand about life. That's the you that's everywhere, the authentic you that's informing everything that you do, even to the point of what stories you choose to tell. But you're also nowhere in the work for reasons that I think we've explored. You're everywhere and nowhere in the work. I want you to think about other art forms because it's sometimes useful to think about them. When a painter makes a painting, every brushstroke is theirs, but unless they're playing with the idea of the metaphysics of making art, they are not in the painting, right? It's the story they've chosen to tell that they put in the frame. They're in the studio. Like, we don't get to see, we look at the painting, we don't see the painter. We listen to a great work of music, and the composer is not playing all the instruments. The music is happening. It's happening for us, but the composer's moved on. They're writing something new, we hope. And my fictional playwright who keeps peeking out from backstage, from behind the curtain, to look at the audience and see how they're doing, and to want to explain things, make sure they get all the jokes. The playwright should not be on the stage. Really, the playwright does not belong on the stage. It's at that point you have to let go. You have to assume a more objective position, and in a way, a more all-powerful position. You got to, stop. There's sometimes advice, which I don't know if some of you agree with it, like, don't worry so much about being friends with your kids when what they need is a parent. Like, you have to take the role on that is appropriate for the moment. Yes, you had a lot of fun writing this, and you want to kind of sit next to your reader while they go through it and sort of be part of that experience too. But alas, that pleasure is no longer yours. Like, you've just got to write it and give it to the reader and move on to the next thing, and just trust that your stories will find, the experience that you've created for them. If you've done your job well, they're going to have a great experience. So, writers, you are everywhere and nowhere in your work. And I want you to think about both of those things. Please be everywhere in your work. Please be authentic with everything that you write, but also be confident that you don't have to micromanage your reader's experience. Learn writing craft, learn story structure, draft and revise, and get your work ready for the reader, and then let it go. Like, trust that it's going to work without your direct supervision. It's like sending our kids off to college, right? Like, you just got to let it go. So think about that as you strategize how you approach thinking about the book you're working on. Is this a book that you plan to let go at the end? Or is this a book that you are trying to make sure that you always get to stay in, supervising? Let your book take flight. Give it to the reader. If you truly write from the heart, you are everywhere in the work, and that's never something you have to force or labor over. I want to thank you all so much for coming today, for being so active in the comments, for posing this really provocative question to begin with, and for all of you who have participated, added questions, comments, examples. It's so helpful. I really enjoy it. As ever, it's so great when someone asks me a question that prompts a live stream. Cynthia's asked a question here about changing lanes in third person. So we'll put that on the to-do list for a future live stream. I think it's a good one. And anybody who has anything that they'd like to suggest, you can leave it in the comments. If you are, as I have asked you to be, on the Path of the Storyteller mailing list, and I'm putting up my thing. Here we go. There it is. I had to click twice. Get on that mailing list because then what happens is you're going to get an email from me every week and you can reply and we can keep this conversation going that way as well. All right. I'm so grateful to you all. I wish you happy writing and I will see you next week.